Oh, all right. Well, thank you everyone, and welcome to the Consensus 2017 panel on global issues. I'm absolutely delighted to be here with what I think is going to be a really interesting panel for an excellent discussion. I've got Rose Chan from the World Bank, Gabriela from the International American Development Bank, I've got Human from the UN World Food Program, I've got Mike from the Center for Global Development, and I have Neil from the UNDP. So what we're here to talk about today is about how blockchain can help to transform international development institutions. And I think we hear a lot discussion obliquely about how blockchain can be used to improve the state of the world, which is central to organizations like mine, the World Economic Forum. And I think what we want to do today is just try and sort of dig into that. And I'm hoping that we can come away with sort of 3 key learnings for you. I'm hoping that we can come away with an improved understanding about how an array of different agencies with different mandates are exploring this technology, come away with a better understanding of the different challenges that they face in the efforts to implement that technology, and finally, there's sort of an understanding about how the needs of these development agencies might differ from those of the traditional blockchain user in the private sector, like a bank or a logistics company. So with that, I want to dive right into the discussion. Come on, tell us a little bit about the work that you're doing in Jordan.
Sure. Just to give a quick background, the UN World Food Program is the world's largest humanitarian organization fighting hunger. Traditionally, when people have been hungry, we've gone there with in-kind food, such as corn or rice, for example, and handed it out. For a few years now, we're also enabling beneficiaries to purchase their own food, a concept known as cash-based transfers. Cash-based transfers can take many forms, such as prepaid cards, mobile money, banknotes, paper vouchers, or so on and so forth. Where the right conditions exist, such as functioning markets, cash-based transfers are shown to be effective in improving the livelihoods of beneficiaries. And they also afford them an element of dignity, so instead of us saying, here's this food, eat it, they can make their own choice of what to purchase. In order to enable it, though, we normally have to rely on financial service providers, so banks, mobile money operators, and so on. So to give briefly an explanation of how things worked in Jordan before we launched our pilot, there's a bank there. So at the beginning of the month, we would say, okay, here are beneficiaries, here how much each one gets based on family size, their needs, so on and so forth. We would give this list to the bank, and they would create virtual accounts for these beneficiaries, and we would also advance the bank all the money that would be needed for 1 month. Then the beneficiaries would go to supermarkets and so on and spend their money using their bank cards. Some of the issues with that setup, one is cost. Of course, the bank charges for that. And at our scale, every 0.1% is more than $1 million. So that really is a thing. The other one is privacy. So often to enable this, you have to share the beneficiary information with the financial service provider. And in the case of refugees, for example, that's not something that's always desirable. The other one is risk. Because you're advancing money to the financial service provider, if they fail during the distribution, then you might lose that money. And in Jordan, it's not a particular problem, but in other places, the amount we distribute in a month is many times the market cap of the company doing it. So that could be a big problem. So anyhow, in Jordan, what we did is we used the private version of the Ethereum blockchain. We uploaded our beneficiary information on it, created virtual accounts. The beneficiaries would visit the supermarket, and they'll actually be authenticated by iris biometric verification. And we keep account of all the transactions that happen. We have different expiries attached, and we can manage everything ourselves. And we pay the supermarket post factum. So with this, we have reduced the bank fees to 0. Mm-hmm. We haven't shared beneficiary information with anyone outside of WFP, and we've lowered our financial risk because we haven't advanced money to anybody. So we've started in this area, but I think on the blockchain architecture that we built, digital identity, vaccination records, microfinance, all sorts of other applications can be built too. But our true hope is that since we're developing open source for other organizations to join us, especially humanitarians, so we can all come around the same neutral platform, which will allow us to reap economies of scale. It would increase the convenience to our beneficiaries. And then if we get standardized data coming in with artificial intelligence and big data, we can really optimize and harmonize the global aid effort to an unprecedented degree. And that's not even talking about cryptocurrencies, which we hope to also incorporate at some point.
That's a remarkable vision. So you're seeing an improvement in the efficiency from a financial perspective, reduction in risk, improved privacy, and you're starting to build a platform that others will hopefully be able to use. Were there any significant challenges that you ran into in your efforts to deploy this technology?
Yeah, I mean, initially being a food company, not many of us had an idea. I mean, I personally was interested in blockchain, but even choosing between Ethereum or something else, I mean, that was the initial part, but we quickly learned. Again, within our culture of food, trying to explain something abstract like blockchain wasn't easy to begin with, but we did have pockets of support within the organization that we built on. And also, as has been pointed out before, that we have a lot of accountability to our donors and beneficiaries. So anything, let's say, new and untested is not very easy to implement, even though it's almost urgent to implement it, given that, you know, whatever benefits go back to the beneficiaries. But thankfully, we've just counted on the people who were supportive, and it's got us so far. Hopefully, we can continue the journey.
That's fantastic. So really interesting. I think that's a great example of a rather mature pilot in this space, delivering clear value. From that kind of ground level, I'd like to ask you, Mike. I know that you're in the process of writing a report right now that's looking sort of at a 30,000-foot view of a wide range of use cases that are being used by development agencies around blockchain. Can you talk to us a little bit about what your key findings are?
Sure. So maybe first I just take a step back talk about the genesis of the project. So I work at the Center for Global Development, and we've been working on this issue of de-risking, which is US, UK banks essentially pulling out of emerging markets, uncomfortable doing business there because of the cost of regulatory risk. And so we were looking at different ways to do payments cross-border, and that led us to cryptocurrencies. That led me to researching blockchain. And I realized early on that when I talked to folks in the development community about blockchain, that there's a lot of waving of hands and not that much expertise within the development community yet. And then you also see these headlines that are quite hyperbolic that, you know, blockchain is going to end world poverty and end world hunger. So I was obviously intrigued. And then the paper I'm working on is really just a survey of what are the potential use cases. So we're looking at remittances, land registry, using blockchain as a platform for digital ID, and also solutions for aid distribution, which Human was talking about. And so there's a diverse set of issues. The one commonality is that the solutions are all geared towards solving for inefficiencies related to lack of trust or lack of coordination. So an example of lack of trust is when you have countries that don't have credible land registry systems. There's a lot of folks pushing the idea that they could use a blockchain to raise the credibility and trustworthiness of those systems. I'm a bit skeptical in the sense that yes, a blockchain can show you that documents are authentic in the sense that once they're in the blockchain, they haven't been tampered with, but it's absolutely nothing to kind of prevent something happening before the document goes into the blockchain. So you still need strong garbage in, garbage out. You still need strong land administrations prior to using the blockchain. And then in a coordination failure, I think aid distribution, Human was kind of getting at, you often have, even if you have a single development project, you have a number of stakeholders across the development project supply chain. You have donors, recipients, implementing partners, monitors, auditors. And the idea of storing the data that they're working off on the shared ledger could lead to massive efficiency gains. And then finally, you also often have donors working in the same region with the same population, yet their engagement and the data they're getting and the processes they're running are completely siloed. So an end vision would be having someone like the UNDP give a digital ID to an intended beneficiary, and this is kind of what Human was talking about, I think. It's then all the agencies working in a certain space kind of plugging into the same system, which has benefits in terms of transparency for donors, but also for the beneficiaries themselves.
Mm-hmm. And so it's still early days, but are you getting an idea of what makes a good use case here? Where are the challenges, and are there some sort of simple tools that can be used for us to understand when a development use case is in fact going to drive efficiency or transparency or any of these other good things, and when it might not be as successful?
I think that's like the most important question. I also think it's really hard to answer now. because we don't have data, right? And we don't have data for two reasons. First, this is a nascent field, obviously. Every business model I looked at was either in the beta testing stage or starting a pilot or just finishing a very small pilot. And the second reason we don't have data is that the startups working in this space have every incentive to be rather tight-lipped about their failures. And even when they report their successes, they're reporting headlines, right? They're not reporting metrics associated with their projects. So it's very difficult for us to really do a true cost benefit of those projects. And so I think my watchword for using blockchain in the space of development, it's not going to be popular, is like patience, right? I think it's going to take a long, long time to go from successful small pilots to scale because of the creatures we're dealing with. We're dealing with development agencies that are, like any large institution, tend to be risk averse. They're stewarding other countries' funds. And most of the solutions I was looking at generally involved a private blockchain, doing something on the private blockchain, then taking a hash and anchoring it to a public blockchain. If you walk into a development agency and you say, here's our solution, half of it is based on this governance framework, which you will have zero control over, I think that's going to freak a lot of people out. Mm-hmm. And so I think whereas you have these aid agencies doing a lot of work in development labs and doing these one-off pilots, it's a huge jump to get to scale.
Interesting. So large conservative organizations focused on development, you might almost immediately think of the World Bank. I don't know if that's fair or not, Rose, but can you tell us a little bit about what you're thinking about? I know that you've been talking about some interesting ideas around smart bonds. What's happening at the World Bank?
Well, lots of things are happening, but also I guess with like other UN agencies, it's all like kind of scattered everywhere across the institution. I think that, we're on one hand agnostic and neutral as to whether or not we'll be forwarding, advising countries to be adopting blockchain right now. I think it's what Mike is saying, that we're being patient. And also, I think that I just want to also echo what Mike was saying, that we do need more data. We need more empirical evidence. We need more pilots and trials, not just of successes, but also of the failures. I think that it's just as important to document what didn't work, because I think that it's nice that people are excited about this technology. It is something which is amazing, but at the same time, I think it's better for the entire ecosystem if we're very truthful about what isn't working as much as like what we dream about. So I think that there's a little bit of a DC crew going with Gabriela and Mike, and also USAID, as well as the UN as well, where we're trying to also coordinate across the agencies to help tracking, and also anybody else who's interested in tracking different cases, both failures and successes. I think it's particularly since it's evolving so quickly that it's not just one person, one agency that could track all of this. It's like all of us, I think if you ask any of us who are in our agencies, we're kind of doing it as a renegade. Like, we don't get budget codes. It's not like we've got blessings from our managers. We're kind of doing it in our spare time, right? And so I think it helps if we all work together to get more data and to understand what is working, isn't working, and then feed that back into developing a technology that will foster some of the visions we have on how it can aid development. Because, what you've been doing, Jordan, is amazing, and it would be really great if we can really track it down and share these experiences with everybody else. I think we're all very excited about it. Without bond thing, it's not very exciting. Is that it's like you hear these little perks that somebody else has been wanting to experiment with blockchain. We're getting, at least within our organization, kind of almost replicating what you might have been seeing in the industry, that people like this word because it's sexy, and they also getting, attention from it, from their managers or whatever, by sprinkling on. So we are getting, so I think that maybe Gabrielle can explain a little bit more, but like we started being evangelists, and now we're getting to a point where we feel a little bit like gatekeepers, and then ensuring that we're not pushing out a product that's premature to our country clients before it's ready. Especially, I think Mike touched on this point, that like our country clients, I think we said it last night, that we can't stuff this up for people who have a lot less. In some ways, these failures could be much more accounted for in developed countries or Silicon Valley, but where we work, it's incredibly important that we have to get it right. So
So I want to pull on this thread of data sharing if I can. So obviously there's a value in sharing lessons learned, best practices, what's worked, what hasn't. But is there more? Is there also sort of sharing of code? Is there, come on, you were talking a little bit about building a platform. Is there something there, sort of joint development, figuring out how to be interoperable?
In our case, not yet, but we're very much looking forward to it. So in fact, we've had discussions with UNDP, with UNHCR, with UNICEF, with UN Women, and anyone else who's willing to listen to see how we could do that. One of the reasons we chose the Ethereum blockchain is that a lot of the code, the code is open source already, so there's not ownership issues of us is better than yours. But during this week, in fact, I hope we can even advance that further. But the hope is there, nothing yet in concrete.
Excellent. Now, let's go over to you. I know that you've been doing an interesting pilot in Serbia around remittance, but also more broadly that you're thinking a lot about the role of blockchain in driving voter registration systems and more broadly digital ID systems. This is something that gets talked about a lot, that blockchain is going to fix the ID problem, but obviously it's a very complex issue. Can you talk to us a little bit about what your thinking on it is?
Thanks, Jesse. Yes. One thing I think it's very important for everyone to note is it's just as with the United States government, there's different agencies, different ministries that probably don't speak to each other very often. The UN is an absolute test case in that. I mean, I think the other night I counted 28 UN agencies that I know of that start with the letters UN. And then there's all the other, like International Organization of Migration, the International Air Transport Organization, World Health Organization. These are all UN bodies as well. So when you add it all up together, there's this enormous bunch of people working very much, unfortunately, in silos. We do not have in the UN at the moment a centralized, regular forum for discussion on matters like innovation in the digital field. So this is the first time I've met Uman, for example. I'm the National ID Advisor, Voter Registration Advisor in UNDP, and we just don't meet enough of our colleagues. One thing we are very, very active in is that in response to national requests to help with voter registration systems, a number of countries have made it absolutely clear they want biometric systems. So they want to invest in high technology population registration systems that, in our experience in the developing world, invariably results in contracting foreign technology companies which can be quite a political issue in the country in question, particularly around the nationality of the technology company that is hired as well. And we've seen occasions, unfortunately, where countries are making these decisions where the actual public institution that's going to manage this technology may have not a single IT graduate working there, may be completely undercapacitated in its ability to adopt and actually own the technology. So we see the role of foreign advisors and the foreign technology company of having a very, very strong, visible political role, which can be a major, major challenge. And going back to what Uman said then earlier, this is a sensitive area, population registration, be it for voter registration, which can decide in many countries who actually wins the election, right? If you win the voter register, you win the elections in a lot of countries that are ethnically or politically divided. Well, when you have this amount of sensitivity around access to and control of centralized data, then it does put a lot of pressure on the UN and the World Bank probably not to be too innovative, not to come up with risky strategies that are seen to be something that we would like to pilot. Let's see if it works. Let's see if we can roll it out. We tend to be very, very risk-averse organizations. As Uman said, we're using other people's money to respond to national requests that are telling us, do not screw this up, UN. We need a clean register, whether it's voter register or national ID. I think one thing that's very, very important to note, though, and that we're all probably very conscious of, when you have state-managed systems, state-controlled, state-managed identity systems, whether they're voter or national ID or whatever, that does create the single point of failure issue. And whether due to accidental or nefarious means, officials within those state management bodies, if they themselves are the ones that are tampering with identity data, it does create a serious political risk for the owners of identity data, shall we say, the citizens themselves. We all saw what happened in countries like Rwanda, where because of state identity systems, people were able to identify people on the basis of one characteristic on a paper ID card. If citizens don't have control over some element of their identity data, then they can be very, very vulnerable to abuse in countries that are victim to these type of politics. And that's why we are very interested in the blockchain area to keep speaking to people, to keep speaking to the private sector, to innovators, to see are there strengths within ledger technology, distributed ledger technology that can somehow empower citizens to be able to defend themselves against potential state attacks, shall we say, over identity data and move it forward like that.
So I want to make sure that I've understood you properly, because on one hand, you've outlined that it's challenging to implement these systems. People want low-risk solutions. We've talked a lot already on this panel about the fact that you've been effectively entrusted with funds for development around some very insecure populations. But at the same time, it seems to be that there are some significant potential upsides. Individuals having greater control over their identity attributes, governments not being able to go in and make incorrect or illegitimate adjustments to the data. Are there other factors, particularly around the voting use case, that are interesting here?
I think we operate in a lot of countries where we respond to requests to help organize their own elections. That's my job on a daily basis. In countries where it really is winner takes all. Winner takes all, to be very honest with you, that is significantly more challenging than in a lot of Western developed advanced democracies. In my own country, if I run for parliament and I don't win, I go back to being a doctor or a lawyer or a teacher or whatever it was. In much of the developing world, you don't win the election, you are then harassed, you are thrown out of the country, you could be imprisoned, you could be tortured, whatever, for going against a government. The stakes are that high. The level of trust in a lot of countries around the validity and the integrity of electoral administration is enormous. So is there a possibility for distributed ledger technology to be able, for example, within the voting arena, for not only electoral administrators, but also the representatives of political parties, domestic observers, international observers, somehow to be able to come together and be able to see transactions on a blockchain that they could all independently verify themselves before that and verify the validity of a vote cast, for example, before that vote is actually opened and counted. That clearly is a possibility that could build a lot of confidence in something like an electoral process. But again, we are operating in countries where literally having enough electricity around in mountainous villages is an enormous challenge to be able to deploy IT systems of this nature. Finding staff, qualified, oftentimes in the thousands, computer literate IT staff that can, in a mountain village, be able to get on a mobile phone if there is coverage and talk to a technical support guy or girl or woman or man a number of miles away and be able to explain why this machine doesn't work, what do I need to do. These are the big problems. What we often find in technology solutions in areas like elections, the problems with them are oftentimes not related to the technology per se. It's the environment, the logistical, the security environment in which they're being deployed, and that unfortunately can't be solved by technology alone in a lot of cases.
Thank you so much. Gabriella, I apologize for leaving you to the end. Can you tell us a little bit about what's happening in the Inter-American Development Bank? What are some of the interesting things you're doing with the asset registry space?
Yes, thank you. Well, the bank is exploring different areas, but I guess one that is a little bit more advanced and in which we are very interested in and we're trying to build a pilot about is asset registries. But really the end objective of this is improve access to finance, especially for SMEs, for small and medium enterprises, and for unbanked individuals, not more than unbanked, I guess, underserved individuals, which in general, this is a great development problem that we need to solve to keep growing in Latin America to increase productivity, right? So the logic follows like this. So when you think about it, most parts of the market, the financial markets and financial market infrastructure deals with problems of imperfect or asymmetric information, right? And traditionally, how do you tackle those when you have this imperfect information, where you either improve the reliability or quality of the information that you ask, or you require pledge collateral. The problem is that these two activities are very costly and difficult, and as a result, or just impossible in some cases, and have left a lot of enterprises and a lot of individuals outside and without being able to access to finance. So we think that blockchain has the potential to deal with these two matters, both the quality and reliability of information and collateral management. And we see this initiative of asset registries in the context of collateral management, not necessarily land, as Mike said, but collateral, specifically movable assets. Why? The promise of movable assets is in the literature for the last 15 years. And in some countries, it has led to some gains, but the promise has not completely fulfilled, in part because of the lack of trust or the lack of efficiency of some of these registries, right? So when you think about it, then blockchain offers some specific traits that make it suitable for collateral management, at least on paper. One, of course, it's more resilient, no single point of failure, which in many countries is a single point of corruption. So the second one, of course, is information that is very difficult to tamper with, so providing trust, which is very needed, especially in movable assets, and increased transparency, auditability, also very important for these registries. But importantly, smart contracts here will play an important role because you can automate, put some logic, and imagine you can do an automatic execution of pledge collateral. So in taking all this together, we think that the efficiency and the cost of collateral management can be decreased, and this hopefully will lead to better credit. And just to finish, you can expand the same idea to other non-traditional assets. And by this, I mean that, well, you know, all this like fintech revolution, broader fintech revolution is helping many of these SMEs to digitize their payments, digitize their financial management. So whenever these enterprises will have, imagine their economic identity or digital footprint, and we can put it in a trusted registry, this can also lead to, we hope will lead to increased credit.
Can you give us an idea of what kind of asset you might put in a registry like this? And who are the stakeholders that you would need to bring together and have buy in to using a blockchain for this sort of system?
Okay, movable assets can be anything from pigs to a car. That's why they call movable assets is different than your home, right? That you know it's not going anywhere. So that's why it's a different type of lending. So it can be really anything that we can put value. You can value that. And I've seen I've even seen like notebooks where people keep the accounts. That can be a movable asset because if that's where the person has it all, believe me, it has a lot of value. Or especially who owns what, which is typical Latin America, to lend people. So and that's kind of, so that can be anything. Another one is, for instance, warehouse receipts. You have producers who have food, they live in a warehouse, and then they can use the receipt as a credit instrument. And then again, we can improve the way this paper is used for credit purposes. And to finalize your question, then you will need, obviously, the government institutions in charge of this. You will need to find a way that banks and other financial providers can connect and see. And that's mainly probably other third parties that can also be part of this. And we will see as we progress who else is interested.
So you heard it here first. We're going to put pigs on the blockchain. Very exciting. One of the things that I've heard sort of coming up a lot in this discussion is these are conservative institutions, but I think we've also heard both on panels like this one and more broadly that in order to really get traction, there's a need for senior executive buy-in. So I guess I'm curious, how are you fostering senior executive buy-in within your respective institutions? And what are the persistent myths that you're needing to dispel, either sort of notions of what's wrong with blockchain or perhaps sort of hype that people have been sold about the fact that it'll walk their dog or make their coffee? I mean, come on, you're pretty deep into a use case here. How did you get buy-in for it?
Well, Wasn't super easy. I was lucky once I ran into our executive director by chance, and in the 30 seconds I had, I explained that she was really interested, so that gave us a bit of support. We found, as I mentioned, a few pockets of, for example, a country director in Pakistan who allowed us to do a quick proof of concept just to show, because we tried to ground it into reality. Blockchain can be really abstract. So we did a quick proof of concept in Pakistan in January, 3 days, 100 people. And just to show that blockchain can be used for food and cash. It really didn't matter what it was, but the point was to show this can be done. And essentially that gave us the traction to the pilot, which hopefully will give us more traction to continuously go larger. And I think the most difficult part is separating blockchain from Bitcoin in most people's minds, and so that's been our main challenge. So.
Does that sort of map to others' experiences in this? Any interesting stories on getting top-level buy-in?
I think one reality that we all face when you deal with administrators at senior levels of public institutions, the vast majority of them are generalists that came through the system and do not have specialized skills necessarily or technical skills. So I cannot think of a single person senior in my organization, for example, that I would describe as a technologist or someone that understands technology. So for that person to fly the flag for blockchain, they have to rely on people at my level and below. Believe me, I'm not a technologist either, but I mean, there's an awful lot of trust when we put senior management in front of large-scale public fora and get them to fly the flag and try and sell innovative technology like this. That is a challenge.
I guess the other thing I was wondering is that, I mean, obviously, the institutions around this table are different in the sense that your mandates are broader than being profit-generating organizations. You have a very diverse set of stakeholders. I'm curious, when you approach blockchain and when you work with service providers in this space, are there needs that you have that are fundamentally different from the needs that the private sector has? And are the service providers in this space well equipped to serve those needs?
Well, I think that what would be useful is to articulate that there are certain things which will be the same. You still be looking for, good firms with teams who have a real product, value, the same things that I think VCs or private sector will look for. But you're right in that there is an extra layer in that the other considerations that we do also think about is fair competition in terms of across the market, particularly in this very nascent space. And that we continue to be a neutral voice in the system to ensure that we're not advocating for one particular company or the other. And that's something that I've been thinking quite a lot more about in the sense that, particularly in this space, people would love to drop names of, we're doing stuff for, the UN or the World Bank. And actually, one of our other colleagues, I think Yoshi, was saying, like, somebody's running around saying they're doing stuff for the UN and they're not, And so I think that's kind of going about a little bit. And so we're very agnostic about this, and we want to ensure that not only in terms of being fair and due diligence to our country clients, but also to ensure that the ecosystem is competing on the right value propositions, not because somehow they got a contract or a procurement. It's because they knew somebody that, it's better for the ecosystem if we actually developed value products for developing countries. Does that answer your question?
Oh, and then
when we put senior management in front of large-scale public fora and get them to fly the flag and try and sell innovative technology like this, that is a challenge.
I guess the other thing I was wondering is that, I mean, obviously, the institutions around this table are different in the sense that your mandates are broader than being profit-generating organizations. You have a very diverse set of stakeholders. I'm curious, when you approach blockchain and when you work with service providers in this space, are there needs that you have that are fundamentally different from the needs that the private sector has? And are the service providers in this space well equipped to serve those needs?
Well, I think that what would be useful is to articulate that there are certain things which will be the same. You still be looking for, good firms with teams who have a real product, value, the same things that I think VCs or private sector will look for. But you're right in that there is an extra layer in that the other considerations that we do also think about is fair competition in terms of across the market, particularly in this very nascent space. And that we continue to be a neutral voice in the system to ensure that we're not advocating for one particular company or the other. And that's something that I've been thinking quite a lot more about, in the sense that, particularly in this space, people would love to drop names of, we're doing stuff for, the UN or the World Bank. And actually, one of our other colleagues, I think Yoshi, was saying, like, somebody's running around saying they're doing stuff for the UN and they're not, And so I think that's kind of going about a little bit. And so we're very agnostic about this, and we want to ensure that not only in terms of being fair and due diligence to our country clients, but also to ensure that the ecosystem is competing on the right value propositions, not because somehow they got a contract or a procurement. It's because they knew somebody that, it's better for the ecosystem if we actually developed value products for developing countries. Does that answer your question?
Oh, and then we've talked a lot today about the need for coordination, about the need for insight sharing. I guess, do we have any thoughts on what the next steps are there to enable that? How can we get the various development agencies better coordinated? You said, Rose, I think that you've engaged in this evolution from evangelist to gatekeeper. What's the next stage of development, and how do we start having the evangelists and the gatekeepers building bridges between organizations?
I think this has been really great, actually, meeting up with Gab, and I think that all of us in the last 12 months have been more cross-agencies, because I found it really useful to have a buddy at the Inter-American Development Bank. Whenever I'm facing something in my organization, I'll be like, Gab, somebody doesn't really know what they're talking about. What do we do? But at the same time, I think that we all understand that we work in very, very, how do you say, conservative or very hierarchical organizations. And I think one of the ideas that we've workshopped is ability to lean on each other a little bit more, considering that a lot of our agencies, like Liam was saying, that not a lot of people understand blockchain. So instead of trying to train other people to be technologists to rely on, now that I know everybody else and Yoshi, and we're trying to gather that we rely on other agencies' technologists, so that we'll peer review, hopefully if there's projects, and we can cross-reference each other as an organization. I think that will be really great. The other thing that I would like to see is ways that we can get together and maybe put together guides and advice for each other. Like, how do we procure blockchain companies? What should we be looking for? How do you engage with the governments? I think maybe a general, sharing a lot more the scarce, empirical data points, I think would be really nice to move forward in.
If I may just, sorry, go on.
Go ahead.
Go ahead. Add to that the traditional UN approach would be to form a committee to study the issues subjected to public inquiry, all of that, and get somewhere too late. So far, this action of just doing something, again, the proof of concept, for example, showed us that it can be done. The pilot is now showing the value of blockchain, so on and so forth. Our hope is to find some commonalities, for example, a location in which we work with other organizations, we might share the same beneficiaries, and then just do a small thing together. That, I think, sends the message of, it can be done. These guys did it, then you add on. So we're hoping to...
Piloting coordination. In
coordination on a small scale, but just doing it as quickly as possible. We think it cuts through a lot of the problems people imagine of how a collaboration might work, what the funding structure would be, what's the legal agreement. All of these things we hope to be able to cut through.
Okay. Now, just quickly.
Two very practical points, Jesse. I think if individual blockchain companies approach officials of public international organizations like that, there's a natural tendency of that public organization to push back. Okay, there's the fear around being seen to be favoring one solution over another is enormous. Our rules around public procurement are incredibly strict and transparent. I really think where technology companies together come and approach via industry bodies or via initiatives like conferences like this, when they approach international organizations together, then so much of that pushback disappears. And then we're able to converse because we're conversing with a number of companies. Secondly, and I hate this is probably not something you want to hear, we are all incredibly busy people that do not have specialized experts whose job it is to go out there and seek out innovative technology solutions in various realms of the public sector or public administration. If, again, technology companies come together and are able somehow to put some amount of seed funding towards us to be able to create the type of positions where those positions can then work full-time with the technology sector to be able to design pilots, to be able to look at ways to scale up and implement projects across larger spheres, I think that would be really, really helpful as well.
Excellent. So we've only got about 90 seconds left. I think we've seen here a panel talking about some of the fascinating opportunities that exist in this space, but also the really significant challenges around achieving the necessary coordination and buy-in to deployment. I want to finish with a quick lightning round. So I'm going to go across the panel, no more than a sentence in response. 10 years from now, when blockchain is even bigger than it is today, what's one thing in your organization that's going to be completely different? Rose?
I'm hoping
one sentence.
One sentence. That the way that we disperse development aid would be completely different.
Gabriela?
Much more open in the sense that the bank will be supporting much more open, public, open source projects, which is different.
Come on.
The beneficiary will have ownership of their own data.
Mike?
I think if you take the army of folks working on mobile money and financial inclusion right now, you take 20 to 30% of those and they probably work on blockchain in 10 years.
I would like to think we have a much, much more formal, regular forum with the private sector, the technology sector, to be able to work together over a period of years to be able to demonstrate results in the blockchain area that can be applicable to large-scale mass registrations of populations, where we can then convince governments, in effect, that this is something that they should really consider.
That's a very long sentence. That's where we'll end it. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming. Thank you to our panelists for a great discussion.